Welcome to Restoring Memory, a COVID Calls exploration of the first two COVID years. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters, and since March 16th, 2020, I've been the host of COVID Calls, a daily discussion of the pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. This is episode number 497. It's March 18th, 2022, here in South Korea, where I'm calling from, March 17th, still back in the United States. The topic today, the pandemic in Korea, with Hyuna Kyum, Seolgi Lee, Yearend Park, and Joelle Champelet. And we're going to move directly into discussion, and let me introduce my brilliant guests to you. Joelle Champelet is a doctoral student at the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy, the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, KAIST. She is interested in the intertwined relationship between technology and territories, everyday practices, and smart cities. During her master's thesis and the pandemic, she focused on the transformation of everyday practices of inhabitants by smart systems in South Korea. Hyuna Kyum is a doctoral student, also in the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy at KAIST. She's interested in the materiality, socioeconomic, and environmental impacts of various wastes. She wrote her master's thesis about plastic wastes during COVID-19 in South Korea to investigate different practices to regulate or promote the use of plastic from the perspective of slow disaster. She wants to expand her research fields into revealing unequal relationships around waste and its impacts on different beings, not just humans, but also non-humans. Seolgi Lee studied chemistry in her undergraduate years and became a master's student also at KAIST in the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy starting last year. She's interested in the dynamics between disaster and victims' identity, especially from a feminist perspective. And my fourth guest is Yearend Park. Yearend is a doctoral student, also in the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy of KAIST. He received his master's degree in theoretical cosmology, but social and environmental disasters have attracted him, and so he's moved down to Earth to pay more attention to human and non-human lives in the world. His research interests cover broadly disaster studies, environmental humanities, and the social sciences, and he'd like to investigate how disaster shapes the world and to develop a way of living together with various humans and non-humans. Hyuna, Hyunbin, Seolgi, and Joelle, thanks for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, so this is part of the research team. We have one more member of the team who's not with us today, and she and her work might come up as well. Jerry, we're missing you. But it's great to have the four of you here with us today. And I'd like to start, Hyuna, I'd like to start with you, actually. You're no stranger to COVID Calls. People should check out other episodes. Hyuna's been a guest to talk about her research, and you've also been a translator in a couple of the most dynamic episodes that we had of COVID Calls with live English to Korean or Korean to English translation. Thank you again for doing that. Those were stellar episodes. But let's talk a bit, first of all, maybe share a bit of your experience of the pandemic, and then maybe you could talk a little bit about your sense of how South Korea dealt with the pandemic, particularly early in that early phase, January, February, March of 2020.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again, and thanks for this opportunity. I had an opportunity to look back over how the South Korea have been dealing with the COVID, and for my personal experiences, I had a chance to introduce in the other episode before. So maybe today I want to share a little bit more about, not necessarily as an evaluation, but more of a description from the perspective of a general citizen. So in the early period of pandemic, let's say early 2020, South Korea started to get international recognition on its unique way of responding to COVID-19. So-called 3T method in public health area was what Korea showed very proudly, which refers to test, trace, and treatment related to confirmed cases. Even President Moon called this very proudly as K-response or K-방역 in Korean. So it can be said very much of material and human resources were mostly focused on containing the virus and flattening the curve. both to relieve public anxiety and to prove governmental capacity to manage crises or emergency situations. However, I think this successful response narrative has been confronted with several criticism as the pandemic moved to later stages. And I wanted to summarize this as four reasons, I think. And first, from the perspective of social vulnerables, people who need special care, especially during the disaster, were ironically those who were excluded from the nation's care radar. This was revealed from the very beginning of the pandemic, since the first victim came out in the Cheongdo Daenam Psychiatric Hospital. And I remember that we discussed in COVID calls this issue more deeply with Korean Justice Party lawmaker Hae Young-jang in last July. And second was from the perspective of surge in plastic waste, which is related with untact culture, where people started to rely upon like single-use products to minimize the contact between people. And I hope we will revisit this topic a little bit later in this episode. And third was about the vaccines. I was also lucky enough to be involved in this discussion of this issue also in COVID calls with virologist Sun Young Baek in last October. And issues around vaccines were A, delay in vaccine supply in Korea, and B, fake news about vaccines which went viral in Korea in early mid 2020. So I would say there were some notion of failure of emergency communication of the Korean government. And the fourth, this is not last not least, but inconsistent and too harsh preventive regulations, which mainly revolved around on A, business hours, and B, upper limit for the number of people in private gatherings. So I think this is still largely influencing citizens to have sort of like hostility toward governmental measures on COVID due to many difficulties such as like aggravated financial status of small business owners and citizens' fatigue on their daily lives. So as of now, March 2020, with all these trajectories, which cannot be marked with just successes in responding to COVID, Korea is actually going through a little bit difficult situations. We had around 600,000 daily confirmed cases 2 days ago, renewing the record of daily confirmed cases almost every day from the mid-February. So, yeah, that this might be.
Yeah, thank you for that overview. And it's been, I think that's part of the challenge of this. And I think you very nicely laid out, the elements of the K response and the way, some of those, they look a certain way in March of 2020, and they look different again in October of 2021. The span of this disaster has been such that the K response can't just be 6 months. It has to be a sustained response. I mean, I just want to say, you juxtapose that. I was talking to Kim Fortune just 2 episodes ago, and she said, one of the hallmarks of this disaster has been the failure of governance at every scale in the United States. So even to get it right, and I think Korea did it better than right, I think did exceptionally well, particularly early in the pandemic, that's really something. But there's a requirement. The standards are high, and there's a requirement that government have endurance to continue to perform at that very high level throughout the pandemic. I want to linger on something you just pointed out, and people might not realize, is that every day is setting a new record with cases here right now. What is your sense, just, sort of lived experience right now, how that's affecting people? Because it's been a long road now in South Korea.
All right, I think my answer is not really like organized well, but the sense and feelings that I shared these days with my colleagues and friends and friend family was people are just starting to giving up. Like maybe my turn is soon to get COVID, and people are not really respecting the role of government to protect people anymore. I think like people are more and more relying upon managing their health individually and with the people nearby. So I think people are getting a little bit sick and tired of being careful to each other and restraining from meeting each other and not eating dinner or lunch together. So I'm a little bit worried about losing some hope and that kind of fatigue, constant fatigue situations.
Solgi Lee, let me bring you in on this. First of all, just to sort of check in with you and see, how you've been during the pandemic, if you have an experience of it that you might want to share with us. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, the victims of COVID in Korea, because I think that connects very much to work that you're interested in with other Korean disasters.
Yeah. Then I'll share my personal experience first. So I started my graduate program in the middle of the pandemic. So I even did my entrance interview through Zoom. So I frankly thought that, well, maybe I could somehow hide my poor English skill like that, in the sense that I could hide my unstable eyeball going around as if I'm like confident enough like that. So after I came to school, one thing I feel sorry was about it seems to be become a little more hard to casually talk about the class content or some like academic talk. So as we all know, we usually log into Zoom by turning off the screen, and when the professor appears, we turn on the cam, and after the class ends, we just left. So I think we need more get more courage to say some idea that might be considered to be silly. So that was my personal experience. And about the victims and supported group, so I cannot say the general situation of all community, but as I keep in touch with a member from the several ferries, so I might say a little bit based on that. So to briefly summarize, the pandemic surely impacts the speed and the way of their activities, I think. So there was a like maritime disaster, so-called Sewer Ferry disaster outbreak in 2014, and among the 304 victims, 250 victims were from one high school, and their family, mostly their parents, keep doing various activities to shout out the value of the life and safety part generally. So these days, one of their main focus is on building the memorial park, which is called Life and Safety Park. However, like I've heard from like one of the member that the schedule are frequently delayed due to the COVID preventive measures. So several families are heard like among various related groups during the process of the memorial building that like you guys, the one who are speaking out about the value of life and safety part. So we should keep the rule more strictly like that. So also on the other hand, like their activities are meaningful when the citizen participate actively, because their goal is to spread the value of the life and safety in the world. But as you can, like we all can imagine, these activities are somehow suppressed in the pandemic situation. So these are the situation they are going through these days, I think.
I appreciate you bringing up talking about the Sewol Ferry, families organization, and something you just said is really important, and people might not realize that, but it's still a very active part of South Korean politics. And so to have all of a sudden the incapacity to gather in large groups or to do the kind of grassroots organizing that they continue to do, do you think that has set them back? Do you think that has had a real impact on their ability to continue to organize, Solgi?
I think they're still relatively coping this situation a little well, but yeah, in some sense they're having a little hard time because like they usually get like invited more and more grassroots people, but these days it's really limited number. So even within the community member, they cannot gather like together that much. So all kind of the grouping session are like become off like online. So few of the really like core member can participate in. So that kind of the situation are going on. But like one thing is interesting from her that opposite part, like something who tried to hatred them, that kind of the activity also suppressed, maybe thanks to COVID, but like, there is other aspect too.
That's really interesting. And just to share, a personal memory of this, and I think all of you will remember this as well. When you go to Ansan and meet with the family members, when they invite you, and they've been kind enough to invite us on several occasions, they have a meeting room, which according to, at various moments in the pandemic, according to Korean rules, I mean, it gets very specific how many people can meet. And so at the times when the rules allowed it, we did make a trip. And in that room, they have the plastic dividers up. So we're in solidarity around a table, sharing experiences, but you're constantly confined in your little plastic cube while you're having the conversation. And I just thought that was such a juxtaposition of two disasters in a way that might not be too obvious to future historians who would look at a photograph of that meeting. But those two disasters were converging around that table. And of course, they're, Selgi, to your point, I mean, they're very fastidious about health and safety, aren't they?
Yeah, right. They are.
So let me just take a moment here to remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls, and we're talking today about the experience of COVID in South Korea with 4 young researchers, Hyuna Kyum, Joelle Champelet, Solgi Lee, and Yearend Park. I want to just take a breather here and actually just give you all a chance to talk about Solgi started us with this, but what it's been like to be a grad student in Korea in a pandemic, in a country that has, frankly, compared to the United States and most European countries, taken this extremely seriously. Masking rules, distance rules, gathering sizes. It's made the normal experience of a graduate student, which is about sociability, it's about informality, it's also about class and being in class, and sharing. It's just made that really challenging for you all, I think. I'm just going to open the floor. Joelle, I'm going to ask you first, maybe if you want to speak to this, just what's it been like being a student in the middle of the worst pandemic in 100 years?
I think for me, also, there's the fact that I arrived in Korea only 5 months before the pandemic. So I started getting used to a way of working in STP and as a graduate student, and then suddenly, then you have to change again. So that was quite big. And then mostly, especially because I think our community in KAIST was very, very dynamic socially and very welcoming in person, which helped a lot as a foreign student coming in a new country. And then suddenly this kind of support kind of not disappeared, but only could work remotely. We couldn't meet anymore. It was hard for me to have help in person or to meet people which I was familiar with. So that was really hard. And just generally, we're mostly social scientists, so we love speaking with people. And then we can't meet, we can't speak every time. And I was working on everyday practices with citizens for my own research. So working on everyday practices when you can't meet people in person and only through Zoom definitely brought forward some kind of barrier and comfort with the people I was interviewing and the people I was trying to share my research with. So in general, I think this was a very big part of it. So the different way of socializing instead of STP and to do research, that was a very big part for me in terms of how this pandemic shaped what it means for me to be a student.
Yeah, Yeonbin, let me give you a chance to come in on that too about being a student. You have a really unique vantage point because you actually were a physics student, and so you had to deal with the reality of COVID in the laboratory environment, and then you joined the STP community, which, as Joelle has said, is an intensely social, in all the right ways, intensely social experience, which has been, changed obviously by the pandemic.
Yes, thank you for having me again, and this is really great honor to be with you in COVIDCalls with my team. Yeah, and at the beginning of the outbreak of COVID pandemic, I was seriously thinking about changing my major with a concern about the Anthropocene and climate change. So as a stepping stone, when I was in still physics department, I was taking science and technology studies in STP in that spring of 2020 to broaden my view on science and technology that have influenced, shaping, and being shaped by our world. And the COVID pandemic really opened my eyes to the truth that nature and culture are deeply intertwined, as the STS course always taught. And moreover, not just as the academic interest, those events seemed to me, yeah, to reveal the precarious state of the world we are living together and sharing. So I felt that I have to change myself and to do something rather than study heavenly things. Since I majored in theoretical cosmology, I always uh, studied the evolution of the very early universe, very near
Yeah.
the time of Big Bang. So it was really heavenly things, and of the pandemic made me to concern more on the earthly and worldly things. So the very point I got affected by the pandemic as a student is that I jumped into this department, more engaged in scholarly activity through disaster studies. Uh, Although now I'm struggling with taking coursework and reading materials all day, so I haven't not much experience in the socially contacting uh, other citizens and other groups beyond the STP. So above all, anyway, COVID pandemic stimulated me for more ecologically sensitive life and studies. Yeah.
Hyunbin, do you think if it's hard to imagine a world now without COVID, but do you think you would have made this transition in leaving physics and coming into social science if the pandemic had not happened?
Um, Maybe if uh, if pandemic didn't happen, but the ongoing precarious and predicaments we are faced, well, for example, in climate change and other environmental and industrial disasters, made me move into
I see.
other segments.
Well, I think we're all really glad that it's physics loss, but our gain. And it's also that you have a really keen eye for the connections that are not always so obvious to people between the sort of environmental issues, Anthropocene, and the way the pandemic is connected with that. That's been a big theme of COVID calls, actually. And it's one that a lot of people have been surprised by. What in the world does the pandemic have to do with the Anthropocene? But I think, that's something that you've been following very closely. I just want to say something about the community of KAIST STP, which I'm a newcomer to as well, having only been here for 13 months. And I was a graduate student in the Department of the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology at Johns Hopkins University. And it's one of the oldest programs in the world in that area of study. And we took great pride as graduate students that we had the most vibrant social atmosphere. So when guests would come to campus, we treated them right. Like even the most uptight academics ended up dancing by the end of the night. We had fun, and we relied on each other a lot. Because being a graduate student is isolating by nature. Reading is something you do alone, and we did a lot of reading. But the way the seminars worked, the way that the colloquium worked, and I got to KAIST and realized that actually STP is that the social environment and the community is even stronger than the one I had when I was a graduate student. And I mean, that's really impressive to me. But at the same time, it just underlines, how the pandemic disrupts things that maybe you didn't even realize were so valuable. until you can't do them anymore. And Hyuna or Solgi, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, but I mean, even something like the holiday party, which is part of STP life, which I haven't really been able to participate in. It's a big part of the sociability of the department over the year.
Shall we say a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
if you want to speak to that, it's fine.
Actually, I think Sugi was not really lucky enough to enjoy have a chance to have the year-end party. But I remember that when I was still freshman of the master student, we had the last year-end party, but then the COVID happened in just 1 month or 2 months after that year-end party. I mean, that was really a festive event we all of the members of SDP are looking forward to, not really for the one full year, but really for a long time to celebrate good things happened in the SDP community for the year and have a farewell to people who are graduating and also maybe invite some people who are deeply connected with us, like friends and families. So it was a really great time to gather together and looking back the one full year. But it's really sad we cannot really have those opportunities. And also on top of not just that kind of festive atmosphere, but one thing that we lost is that as Sergey Lee mentioned before, we just turn on the Zoom right before the class starts, and also we leave the Zoom room after. But before the COVID, we had some chance to go into the conversations in the middle of people are saying somewhere there and somewhere over there, and also getting to know people who are not really familiar with, but get to know with friends of friends in the classroom or in the seminars or even in the academic conferences. So I think we all miss that kind of atmosphere to have more opportunities to getting to know different people.
Let me just quickly remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls. We're talking about graduate student life in the pandemic, and we're talking about the pandemic in Korea. Joelle, I want to return to you and talk a bit about your master's research. You said something really fascinating a moment ago. It's, your goal was to understand, to be able to kind of immerse yourself as a social scientist and really be up close and watch how people interact with technology in Korea, and particularly smart cities. And then the pandemic really threw a curve at your study design, didn't it?
It did, because suddenly everyday life became very different than what it was to begin with, because you didn't go to work every day, and then suddenly you had to use all of those devices to tell where you were going and to register inside public spaces when you went out to go to public spaces. So I think that was one of the hardest part of it. But what was also interesting is that suddenly the technological aspect of our daily life, the daily life in Korea, was very, very enhanced, because you needed to have your smartphone to be able to register and enter restaurants, enter any kind of buildings. And then you also had to choose all of this news about how many people were infected by text messages. A lot of the information also went through technology. So for sure, it was a very, very big part of what the K response, as Hannah said earlier, was. And it's probably one of the parts which actually strived the most. I don't know if I could say in a positive way, but actually really, really was developed a lot. And then I think what is interesting, because for me, I generally compare with my own experience if I was in France back at home. And I think there was very, very big, the reason for which this part of the pandemic response and K response was striving is that Korean people, and actually around me, I could see it, people are willing to actually use the technology. And there is a kind of familiarity with using the smartphone so much and using this kind of new devices so much. And also the fact that I think probably Korea also had experiences with this kind of pandemic. I think with MERS earlier. And then I think the Korean government developed a kind of response, at least technologically wise, and how the data, personal data, were used, which was a little more transparent than it was for MERS. And that's why it worked a little more, and it didn't receive completely sudden backlash upon it. And there was also the fact that technology wasn't always the only answer. If you go into public spaces, you had the QR code, which seemed pretty new, and then but you also could just call, make a phone call, or just write down your name and your phone number on a paper list, which was a pencil, which was also why I think it worked so well, and why people didn't fully, completely have a backlash against this overpresence of technology. In general, I think the pandemic really highlighted kind of a technology sense of Korea as a nation. So there is the idea of exporting the K model, as Hyuna mentioned before, which is also very related with technology which are developed in what's called the K smart city. And then all of these new technologies which were implemented and which are actually very used inside of smart cities suddenly were way more visible internationally. And then there was an enhance in how much Korean government wants to import and export this model. So I think it made Korean technology more visible on the international scene for sure.
I just want to linger there for a second on a couple of points. One, your description, I really appreciate your description of the multiple modes of what we might call gatekeeping, pandemic gatekeeping in a place like a coffee shop in South Korea. I was astounded when I arrived that the many different technological interfaces that you had to negotiate, right? So QR code, phone number, so one of those two, so that you're registered that you were there. So that's mediated through your phone. But then, of course, also some device to take your temperature. And there are many different versions of that, either doing it yourself or one that scans. Something to dispense hand sanitizer. But then also, as you said, the notepad and the pencil as a sort of a redundant technology, but still an important one, writing, pretty old technology. And there it is, so that the record is still collected. And I thought that was really, really impressive, and particularly coming from the United States, where none of those things were in place when I came here in 2021. It felt simultaneously very laborious to me, because I was not used to that labor of interaction, but at the same time, it felt very, and maybe not everybody will agree with this, but I felt very comforted by it. It felt to me, yes, there's the surveillance aspect, data is being collected, and I realize that we have to always be critical of that. But to me, coming from the United States, it actually felt like a gesture of care. And maybe I'm in the minority of this, and maybe, if you were in Korea the whole time, you might have experienced that differently. But I have to say, as a person coming from outside, I was very enthusiastic. I would do all of it. I would write down, because that interaction was something that meant something to me, that the state actually took my health seriously. Joelle, that sort of knife's edge of how the technology can express care, but then it can also veer towards authoritarianism. You're interested in that.
Yeah. That's a big part of discussion around technology in general, especially today, where technology involves sharing your data and sharing your position and sharing what you do in general. I think this pandemic really showed how much control and how much information government and institutions can have, or any kind of institution, private, public, can have about you on a very, very short notice and in every moment of your life. I think if we take all of us and we could actually follow us around for 2 years, because every time we had to go anywhere, we had to log into something or to say we are here. So that's for sure one big thing of the current discussion. And I think it needs to be discussed even more. And the pandemic maybe sometimes highlighted. There was some crisis around that, around potential witch hunt of patients, of people who got sick of COVID and that were witch hunted by the citizens through the information that were given. Because even though the government kind of, tried to erase personal identification, they released so much information that it was still easy for people which really wanted to find who people were to find about it. So I think there needs to still have a little more conversation about this and discussion about how to efficiently protect personal information and how much you can deliver to the public to reassure them while protecting the patient itself. Because in the end, the patient is already sick, he's already a victim of a disease, and then he suddenly also becomes victim of kind of social stigma of being sick, which is already hard on him and hard on his family as well. So I think there is a need of more discussion around this and the balance between sharing and keeping private by institutions, but also by ourselves in situation which might not be health crisis. I think that needs to be thought a little more.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's a nice reiteration of what Hyuna started us, sort of the points about the K response and the critique of the K response. And I arrived after many of those issues were already worked out, but I think, particularly the ways that some communities were minoritized, that some people felt, people who were vulnerable felt that they were made more vulnerable by the state response. Those are narratives that we absolutely have to collect and shine light on. And I want to just also say, I think that's doubly important because the Korean government has been exceptional in promoting the K response around the world as a success. And it's become a brand. So I can't tell you how many times before I came to South Korea, people said to me, people who are experts in epidemiology would say, oh, you're going to South Korea, they've done everything right. So it's already become a global discourse that South Korea has done everything right. And I don't think it's our job to tear down the response, but it is our job to collect the relevant stories so that it can be better next time. Let me, Hyunbin, let me come back to you. You were sharing with us your sort of personal journey from the lab to the seminar room a moment ago, but I want to ask you a bit about your research interests, because this has been a really interesting time to look at what we might call compound disasters, the way that disasters interact. And I wonder how you think about that, with climate change and seasonal dust and air quality issues in South Korea, not to mention the ongoing war, which one still experiences if you go to the DMZ. And then to have the pandemic layered into that, how are you conceptualizing the interaction among these different kinds of disasters?
Yes, physicists are always interested in the interaction, of the components, not those components, but the interaction of them. Anyway, over 2 years, COVID-19 became a kind of default value in the social setting, so that we can easily see how multiple disasters are overlapping and how much the impact of each disaster is amplified. So let's start with the experience that our team also had in the DMZ. Due to COVID-19, I got to know that the stock farmers are aware of multiple zoonotic diseases before the COVID pandemic. They frequently faced with the multiple outbreaks of zoonotic disease, such as avian influenza and swine fever and cattle plague. So when they occurred together, it is called double demic or even triple demic. So last January, we had visited the area near the demilitarized zone in South Korea, which is located upper part of Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do, which means it is the borderline of near the borderline of with North Korea. There was a field trip held by the Center for Anthropocene Studies in KAIST to meet residents and hear about the crane conservation efforts there. So those areas are specialized in agriculture and livestock industry too. So there, I can see the warning notice about the swine fever for the pig farm, which is infected from the wild boar. So of course, there is a warning notice about the COVID-19 as well. And although humans are not sensitive to swine fever, pigs are sensitive to COVID. So pig farmer pig farms in the near the DMZ were situated at the double damage at the time, I think, and this terminology, yeah, double damage can be applied beyond the livestock industry, I think, where multiple disasters occurred together in a wide range. Uh, so one only example I want to shed light on, as Hyuna mentioned about the Cheongdo Psychiatry Hospital, I also want to share the experience of the homeless people are multiply vulnerable to COVID-19 and heat waves during the first summer after the pandemic, and they couldn't keep safe distancing from other people in the society since they usually have no room or only have poorly conditioned room. And during summer, they usually have rested from the heat in the public places where there are air conditioners. And however, they couldn't access those public places due to the social distancing policy. And I just want to share the problem of homeless in South Korea is long-standing since after the financial crisis in 1997 and transforming to the Mill River region in the 2000s. And the 2020's COVID-19 made their lives even worse. Isn't it too long?
No,
Uh,
yeah. And can you
yeah,
say
definitely.
can you say just a little bit more about the ways that, so you talked about our trip to the DMZ that the Center for Anthropocene Study at KAIST helped facilitate. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, you should, I'll put it out on social media and people can grab that. I mean, KAIST is a really dynamic place to study disasters at different scales, and the center is an important part of that. But it was the first time when we were there, we met farmers who are actively engaged with trying to create habitat for migratory cranes. And I just want to linger with this for a second with you, because that's the necessity of that itself is a reflection of previous disasters of industrialization and habitat loss. But it also, it's an example of sort of bringing species, in this case, cranes and humans, into closer contact than they might have been before. And it's there. I mean, literally, you're inside very close to the DMZ. I mean, in some places you're right at the border. I found it incredibly disorienting to try to keep in mind all of these different layers of risk that were coming into contact. And I guess I would bring it back to you as a question, like, how do you as a researcher, how do you keep that straight? I mean, if you have to choose sources that help you sort of put those things into one frame, what are you focused on most?
Focused on most. That's really a difficult question. Mm, uh, could you more elaborate the research strategy in?
Yeah, I mean, and I think maybe it's part of it has to do with the approach of maybe the talking and the interviews that go on. And I know you've been interested in that. So like when you talk to the farmers there, what do they say?
Oh, actually, at that moment, I didn't talk about the uh, COVID-19 and also other animal diseases in there,
Right.
because most of the farmers I met are working in the agriculture, so they are just concerning about uh, the crane habitat and the conservation efforts in their region. Uh, so I would like to more investigate the interaction between other uh, disasters, for example, avian influenza or
Right.
relevant to birds.
One of the conversations I had recently, Hanbin, which I wish you had been there for, it was a conversation about origins, pandemic origins, and I was talking with Christos Linteris and Monica Green and Jacob Steer-Williams, and one of the things that is pointed out is, when you start talking about zoonosis and the spillover of disease from one species to another, it's not just a one-way experience. In fact, there can be evolution and then spillover back into what called deep reservoirs, so animal populations. And that they believe that this is actually happening with deer in North America with COVID. And so, I haven't seen that kind of discussion around the cranes per se, but it does, when we start reflecting on changing relationship between two species, in this case, humans and birds or humans and deer, we have to be aware that there's, there's a potential for a lot of risk being sort of created and passed back and forth. And I think that's one of the things probably you're interested in the aspect of the Anthropocene.
Yes, really. Mm-hmm.
So we probably, we just have a couple of minutes left. And I think we probably, we should conclude, and maybe I can just do a real quick round. We can go around, and if anybody wants to say anything, as we conclude. One of my questions, of course, and it's too soon to say, but I'm interested how you think the pandemic has changed Korean society, if it has fundamentally changed Korean society in any way, how it may have changed Korean government or higher education. What will be the marker of change? Because those thermometers are going away. The notepads are still there, I guess. The QR codes are still there, but a lot of the technological apparatus of the pandemic is starting to disappear in South Korea. And so it'll be kind of your job to document exactly what the impact was. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, even preliminary thoughts as we finish up our conversation. Hyuna, let me ask you first, and I'll just open the floor to anybody who wants to throw in an idea.
I think I can say what it's related to what I wanted to say in the master's thesis, and my thesis was about one of the ways to talk about the environmental impacts COVID had in Korea, and especially about the regulations, modified regulations around the plastic waste. And throughout the study, I think I wanted this COVID-19 pandemic as a marker to open up policymakers some more alternative imaginaries and different knowledges where disaster at one scale in a public health does not really obscure another disaster at another scale, like environmental scale. So I think COVID-19 pandemic will be marked as a crucial period of time. People realized we cannot really necessarily prioritize one disaster upon another disaster, which has been often accumulated from a long time ago. So I want this to be a urge for public policymakers to think in that perspective.
Thanks for that. Does anybody else wanted to share an idea about future directions of research coming out of the pandemic?
I would like to add that the one thing we need to focus might be the ways of the solidarity. So we ironically become more aware of the importance of the solidarity than before, but it became more hard. So we created like alternative way of the expressing solidarity and so on. So maybe one way we still can find some hope might be, so we can focus on some solidarity going on and how it changed them. That might be good.
I interviewed Jason Ludwig, who's a graduate student at Cornell, just a few hours ago. And you know what he said, Solgi? He said, graduate students right now are experiencing a feeling of solidarity and a commitment to social justice that he didn't think that the older generation, my generation, he didn't say it like this, but he meant it in a kind way, but he felt that it was a turning point right now. And I think that's congruent with what you're expressing.
Yeah, right. Well, I should have talk with him.
We'll get you together for conversation for sure. We're trying to get him over to Korea sometime soon. He's doing amazing research. Hyunbin or Joelle, I don't know if you want to add anything. We're on the way out now.
May I add one point
Please.
on this trend? Yeah, that I hope it keeps continuing. That is the the people in South Korea are also being aware of the relevance between COVID and climate change. So even Korean experienced the longest period of a rainy season during the 2020 summer. So probably due to the climate change. So many citizens, especially pro-environmental citizens, are worrying that climate change would gradually make a more adequate condition for zoonotic viruses to flourish. So, as like me, many citizens are aware of the trend. They are the climate activists also argue the linkage between climate change and COVID-19 and provoke climate justice not only for the vulnerable peoples but also for animals and plants that share their precarity in this world. COVID seems to make us be sensitive to other environmental issues, I think. This is my observation, and I hope this is keep continuing.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree with that completely. And Joelle, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
I think one aspect that I would like to see continue is how much people are become more familiar with sharing research, sharing their talk from different continents to one another. You did this with COVIDCalls. It existed like a lot of conferences, a lot of classes, and a lot of seminars suddenly became way more accessible for us as students, but also for us to speak about our ideas, for us to show and have very, very interesting and very important discussion. And I think that should continue even once the pandemic goes down. But I think that was just a small thing I wanted to add on how pandemic kind of changed what it means to do research and to be students.
That I agree with you on that, and I hope there is a sort of, it's one aspect of disaster which is important. I'm going to say positive, but that I'm going to qualify that by saying it's positive, but it's not always easy to predict what the impact will be. But it's urgency, and and to see the world and its challenges urgently. Even though we might be talking, as Hyunmin was just saying, we might be tracking slow disasters, but to experience them urgently as we have in the pandemic, that's important. And making new forms to interact and learn when we can't get together to do that in traditional ways, I think is also super important. I think you've all shown that in quite unique ways in your own research. You've had to work around. None of you have been able to do research like I was able to do when I was a master's student, which was to show up in person at an archive, have a librarian help me day and night and work very closely with people and materials. You've had to work around those things, and it's really impressive actually what you've accomplished. Hyuna, I think you wanted to take a second here at the end.
Yeah, just before really wrapping up, we just wanted to celebrate you on your last warning episodes to reaching to 500 of COVID calls. And we're really happy. And so we prepared a small image to celebrate you actually. Ta-da! Ta-da!
Whoa!
Oops!
Oh, yeah.
Wow, look at that. That's
Jerry
amazing.
made this.
Yeah, Jerry made
We're with Jerry.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Jerry.
So
Thank
really,
you to
we're
the whole
proud
team.
of you.
Yay.
You're a great team. And having this kind of interaction is why I came to Korea. And my expectations have been surpassed a million times. And it's because of the genius of all of you and the way that you build community. And, this has been a great call. And I really appreciate you taking time out of the many other things you're doing to talk with us here as we're getting close to the 500th episode. What a nice gesture. And maybe it's a small advertisement to others around the world who are considering graduate study in science and technology policy. Could you imagine being in a better environment than this one? Come study with us at KAIST. So we should close there, just reminding everyone that you've been listening to a special Restoring Memory episode of COVID Calls as we're getting close to the 500th episode. And momentarily, I'll be back on, so please do stay on. I'll be interviewing Taikoza founder and taiko drum master Marco Leonhard. So you don't want to miss that live performance of taiko drumming. Yearend Park, Hina Kyum, Solgi Lee, Joelle Champlain, thanks for who you are and what you do, and thanks for this time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you next time.